Welcome back to this video series on Java methods. In this video, I would like to dissect a method and discuss each part of the method. We'll discuss the various reserved keywords and the method header, the return keyword, and we'll discuss how to define and call a method. Method anatomy. In this slide here, we have a sample method called calculate numbers. So that's the method name. And then there's a couple of different reserved keywords that start off this method header. There's this one called public, and that's the access modifier. And we'll do a quick example of how public, private, protected plays a factor into who can access our code. There's this keyword called static, and it's a little difficult to understand outside of object-oriented programming, but I'll do my best to explain static apart from object-oriented principles. Then int. So in the method header, we could get to define what gets returned from this method. In this case here, this method is returning a value that's of integer data type. So here we have sum equals x plus y. That's going to be passed into this method. We'll talk about the parameters in just a second. But what gets returned from this method is going to be of integer data type. Now, if this method didn't get any return, if nothing was going to be returned from this method, we'll say void. So every method returns something, even if it's void. And then here we have something called the local variable. Int sum. Basically, this variable is only local to the calculate numbers method. And then we already kind of spoke a little bit about this sum and what it returns, but there's a reserved keyword called return. And this is, like I said, methods can either have something that comes into it. So here we can pass information into the method. We could pass it via what we call parameters. In this case, we're passing it two values. We're passing it int x and int y. And then also we can return information from the method. And that here we have to use the return keyword. We can return different data types. So we can return integer, we can return double, we can return array, we can return object data type. So any data type that we've already discussed, we can return that from the method. And again, if it's something that we don't want to return from the method, we can use something called void. And void is that there's nothing being returned from this method. There's two parts to a method. One, we first have to define the method, and this is an example of defining the method: public static int calc numbers. And then here you'll see calculate numbers is what we would call it. So we'll talk about this later in the video, but let's first talk about this access modifier and what this means. And actually, before we talk about what this means here, let me just make mention that with these parameters here, we first have to define. And so here we're defining int x and int y. But then when we call this method, we use the method name, calculate numbers. And then in this case here, we're passing it an integer value of 6 here, and then an integer value of 12 here. But it must be the correct data. We must define the data type that's being passed into this method. And these are both of integer data type, so 6 and 12. So what gets returned from this is going to be 6 plus 12. So this method simply just adds two numbers together, and then sum is going to hold the addition of 6 plus 12. All right. So now let's look at the public access modifier, the private, and then even talk about what protected means. So let me clear my screen. Okay. So here I've created a new program. I've scaffolded my application. And I've created two files. One is called a student file, and then one is called a teacher file. Within my teacher file, this is very similar to what we've seen in the previous videos, where we have the class name, it's called teacher, and then we have one method, and it's the main method. The main method is what kicks everything off, and what it invokes basically starts my program. What may be new here is the addition of a new file, and I have a student.java file. I've defined two methods within this class. The first method is called add student. The second method is called remove student. And again, remember, we're talking about these access modifiers or access specifiers. Both of these methods currently have public, where anybody in a program, in this program here, in the source folder, can access any of these two methods, right? Let me prove that. So here, we go to our teacher. So here's a good question. This is, like I said, this is maybe new where we have two files. How do we bring in information from our student file into our teacher? Easy. What we would do here is we'll call the student class first, and that'll make available what methods we have available from us from the student class. In this case here, because they're both public, we have access to add student as well as remove student. So if we say add student, and then we can also say student dot remove student. Let me clear my terminal. And if we run this program here, we get output. We get output from both our add student and remove student. And essentially within our student class, we just have some text that says student added, student removed. So that works. But then again, we're demonstrating this access modifier. Now, what if I change this here to private? What do you think is going to happen? So if you think it's not going to work in our teacher class, you're absolutely right. So if I save this and I go back to my teacher.java file, you'll see that I have this red squiggly. And it's basically here saying that this method remove student is not visible to our teacher course, our teacher class. And the reason being is because we set it to private. And so you see a good use of how we can actually use these access modifiers or access specifiers to restrict our code from different parts of our program. Now there is another one here called protected. So if we go back to our slideshow, let's jump back here. There's protected and there's default. And the default is pretty easy. Let's say, for instance, if we did not have anything here, let's say we took off the private, this should still work. Is that if we don't define it as public or private, the default is that it should be public. So if we control save and then we go back to our teacher class, this should still work, right? So if we run this, let's first clear our terminal and then we run it. It should still work, right? And that's because by default, if we don't specify public or private, it's automatically public for the class that is within, or it's public for for classes that are within the same package. Let's go back here and talk about protected. Protected, this has to do with more of object-oriented principles and inheritance. But protected is that a class can stem from another class, or in this case here, we can have a class kind of like a parent and a child class. And so the children can have access to the parent, and even non-subclasses or non-children subclasses can have access to the parent. And so that's why we have yes here for that. And so if we go back to our code example, in this case here, if we set this to protected, this student class still has access to this remove student. But if we save this, Control S, and we go to our teacher, we shouldn't be able to run this, if my memory serves me correct. Only children of this class would have access to the student. Again, we'll talk more about protected, but I would say for right now, just understand the use case of private and public in our scenario. Last but not least, what I would like to do is talk about how to define a method and then how to call or invoke a method. And we've already done that to a certain degree, where we've defined add student method and remove student, and then we called it in our teacher program. But let's just stick with the teacher class here. And what we're going to do is we're going to define a new method. So to first define a method, we have to define methods within a class, right? Our class is the container for our methods. So in this case here, let's just say we want to create a method that says welcome students, right? So or just give a welcome message that says welcome to the class. And so we'll say public as our access modifier, static. And static is the opposite of static is an instance method. And so static methods are typically attached to the class. And so even in this example here, these were both static methods, but in order to use these methods, we had to first call the class because they're static to the class. You can never create an instance from these methods or use them apart from the class itself. And so if the static keyword is attached to a particular class, they can only be used as a part of the student class. And you have to first call the student class first, and then say student.add student. So it's a small explanation of static. And then we'll talk more about this reserved keyword static when we get to object-oriented principles. So here we're going to say static, and the void keyword is that this method is not going to return anything. And we're going to talk more about returning and passing things to a method in the next video. And we'll just say welcome message. Open and closing parenthesis. And we just do a sys out, the system.out.print line, and say welcome class. So the first thing, whenever you're creating a method, you create the methods within the class. And you have to define the method. So this will be an example of defining a method. That's the first step. In order to use this method, we have to call or invoke it. We can invoke this from anywhere, but in this case here, I'm going to call or invoke this welcome message from within our main method. And in order to call or invoke, we're going to call it the method by its name. In this case, the name is called welcome message. And so here, what happens when you execute your program, it's going to look for the main method. It's going to run everything from the top to the bottom of the main method. It's going to get to line number 5 here. It's going to say welcome message. It's going to look first within the class itself. It's going to look in teacher and say, is there any message called welcome message? Yes, that has 0 parameters. Yes, it's on line 9. So it's going to call that message, and it's going to run every statement that's defined within that method. And so in this case here, it only has one statement that outputs welcome class. And then once it gets down to line 11, the closing bracket, it goes back up to the welcome message, and it goes on to the next statement. So if we were to save this, Control S and run it, we should just get welcome class. So in our next video, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the idea of how we can actually pass data into our method, but then also return information from our method. And then you'll see that this void keyword is really a placeholder that where we can define what returns from the message, or the method, I'm sorry. And so in this case here, we define void because this method doesn't return anything. It is basically outputs a message. But if we want to return something from this method, we would have to define the data type of what data is going to be returned from the method. So stay tuned for the next video where we talk about how to pass things into methods and also return information from a method.